Hey everyone, so I'll be recapping round three. All the matches in round three were drawn, and a lot of people have actually recapped the Faruja Nakamura game, which was very interesting. But I want to look at Liren versus Richard Rapport today. So Ding started off with 1d4. Ding is actually usually a 1c4, 1d4 kind of player. This is very in his style. Knight f6, c4, g6, indicating that Rapport is ready to go on either King's Indian defense or Grunfeld. After knight c3, his intentions are very clear. Rapport wants to go into a Grunfeld, which is a very sharp opening. It takes a lot of prep. There's a really good Smidler course on Chess24 on a Grunfeld. So white took, and this is the main line, bishop g7. And basically, black's entire idea here is that he's going to play c5. He's going to try to chip away at white's center and claim that white has overextended his center and that it's liable to be attacked. So white has a lot of ways to respond to this. After c5, knight e2 is the main line, knight c6, bishop e3, castles. And now here we come to a very interesting point in the game where Rapport chooses this trendy b6 line. You don't have to play like this. Actually, there are a lot of moves here. There's bishop g4, queen c7, knight a5, bishop d7, c takes, and it's just a very complex opening, and there are lots of ways to play against this for black. So b6 has been very trendy. In a recent game between Praggnanandhaa and Giri, the game went like rook c1, which is how this game went as well. And Pragg decided to go h4 here, actually. Instead of rook c1, after e6, he pushed the pawn a little bit further and basically encouraged black to take this pawn, which sets up this like really nasty queen trap with like knight f4 tricks. It was a pretty complicated game, but Pragg won that game pretty decisively. This happened in a chess.com tournament. And Pragg just completely destroyed Giri this game. Anyways, you could check that out. It's Pragg versus Giri. My chess base says it's like chess.com int 2022. Probably an online tournament. So instead, rook c1 was played here. Bishop b7. This is black's whole idea, is to play b6 and put the bishop on b7. It's a very trendy way to play nowadays. And here, bishop b5. At some point, this bishop is actually quite annoying because it might take the knight. It might also create a pin if the rook is ever on e8. And we'll see the role this bishop plays in the game. I do want to take a little quick note here that if this pawn is taken, takes, here white gets a really good position with queen a4. This bishop becomes very strong in combination with the queen. The knight is under severe pressure, and after knight a5, d5, white has a really good space advantage. The bishop is kind of blunted, and that's why no one really takes on d4 here. But that's just a quick note. So rook c8, queen d2, intending something on the king side, maybe bishop h6, maybe h4, maybe h5. Also just ready to bring the rook into the game via d1. So c takes now. And as you can see, queen a4 is no longer a possibility. So this is fine. And now queen d6. This is actually a new move. I think it's been played in like one other game. Usually people have played here e6 instead to try and prevent d5 from coming, or at least try to minimize the damage that would happen if d5 was played. So for example, if d5, e takes, and now the knight just moves. And there's actually quite a bit of pressure on this pawn, and it's actually isolated. So it'll be a little bit tricky for black to defend it in the long run. But in like other games, for example, in this game between Yu Yangyi and MVL, I went like this, where similar idea, queen d6, now h4, a6, and this actually petered out into a draw. But yeah, it became like a very sharp position here, and petered out to sort of like just a very clean endgame, and this was eventually drawn. So instead of this, queen d6 immediately, rook d1, and now queen b4. And the idea is that if, for example, white were to exchange this, then all the pressure is off, actually. Black has no real weaknesses. These pawns are very solid. This is very solid. Black actually has a 2-on-1 majority here, which might come in handy in the endgame. So it's actually not bad for black. So e6, for example, f3, like this is how the game might go. Yeah, and black is completely fine here. He should have no problem either drawing or holding this. But anyways, this was not taken, queen d3, to avoid the queen exchange. And now e6, again, to basically minimize the damage that d5 would cause. e6 would be ready to capture it. So h4 and rook d8. And this has actually been seen before, amazingly. Giri and Nepo had a game here, which went bishop g5, which is what happened. Well, bishop g5 is a game between Ding, Liren, and Rapport. But with Giri and Nepo, the game went a3, where the queen was first kicked. This also actually blocks the knight from coming into b4, and then bishop g5 was played. And the game actually also fizzled out to a draw, where a lot of pieces were exchanged, and they got this endgame, and they drew in actually a couple of moves here. They just repeated moves. So instead of that, bishop g5 was played immediately. And this poses a very difficult question to black, is how does he really respond to this? He can play a lot of moves here. I do want to go over the various moves that black can try here and the consequences of them. So let's start with, first of all, what was played was knight takes d4. But I do want to go over why, for example, rook d7 wasn't played. For some of the stronger players who watch this, it's pretty obvious that d5 just wins because of this pin. Now, it's important to include a3 because you don't want to allow knight b4 tricks where they hit your queen and then maybe they save the rook. So a3 is important, queen f8, and the knight is pinned and it's gone. The same thing happens for rook e8. Basically, d5 occurs after a3, and the knight is once again pinned. So you can see how this bishop is actually a very annoying piece for black to deal with. So, okay, what if we don't play any of that? What if we just play, instead, rook f8, going back? Then the same thing happens. The queen is actually pushed away. It doesn't really have a good square to go to, so let's say it goes to d6. And now e5, queen d5, knight f4. And here white just has a pretty good game going for him. If, for example... well, actually, white is a piece up here. But let's say that this didn't occur. Of course, black can try more things. Let's say queen d7, for example, just avoiding this knight. Queen g3, and suddenly it's kind of annoying because d5 will come, and maybe this pawn will be pushed forward. This queen is actually pretty well placed, and it's not very clear how black is going to untangle here. Okay, so let's go back. Instead of this, what if f6? Seems reasonable. If f6, then bishop d2, the queen is hit again. a4, h5. And this creates a permanent weakness on the 7th rank. The king is actually slightly more exposed because f6 was played. The other thing that this does is it does weaken g6. And white has plans to play knight f4, move the queen away, and try to get an e5 to somehow basically attack this g6 pawn and maybe soften up this kingside structure here. So that's why f6 was not played. It's a very risky move. Instead, Rapport decided to just give the exchange, which is reasonable here. Although the computer says that this is actually winning for white, it's not very easy. It's actually a very difficult position to play because black has successfully done two things. One, it has actually gotten rid of this very vital dark squared bishop. Two, it has gotten rid of this center pawn here. So I think compared to all the other options, this is actually not a bad try. Because you got rid of white's major attacking ideas in the center, and you got rid of this dark squared bishop, and now this bishop has no opponent. So actually, it's not a bad way to play. So Ding tried h5. And now bishop e5. And the idea is that eventually white would want to play h6 here. So this was just to give the king some more room. I also just want to briefly mention that a move like, let's say, instead of bishop e5, if you're trying to win this piece, this distraction tactic does not work at all. After queen takes, this is not working because rook d8 comes, followed by knight g3, and then queen f6, and then at some point h6, and it's going to be horrible for black. I think black is just losing here completely. There's really no way to stop this attack. The knight might come in at some point as well. It's just a very impossible position for black to defend. So this is the sort of tricks that really exist in this position. Is the back rank is actually kind of weak. And this is pretty common when you have 2 rooks versus 1. So instead of this, bishop e5 again to give the king more room on g7. So a4, this just frees up the queen in a way, basically allowing it to move. This knight obviously cannot take this bishop, the rook just hangs. So king g7. Now, I do want to show you what happens instead of king g7. If, for example, black decides to take the knight on e2, then we have these exchanges, and now king g7. And here, the problem here is that for black is that e4 is actually not hanging. So if this was taken, for example, let me just show you. So if takes, well, let's say white plays a move. Rook c1, for example. If this is taken, then rook e1 is actually winning material because of this tactic. Now, it's interesting to note that black can avoid this with this check. So that is why, in this position, white would have played king f1. And the difference is now, after this is taken, and rook e1, after f5, f3, there is no bishop d4 check. So this piece just falls. So black can't save this. A very interesting little nuance to note. I just found this really interesting. And that is why after king g7, king f1 was played for that exact reason. It's interesting to see how these 2800s basically calculate. The reason king f1 is played is because at some moment this e-pawn will drop and there will be bishop d4 check, and king f1 avoids that entirely. It allows the rook e1 tactic. That's just amazing. That's amazing calculation. So knight takes e2 now, takes, and again this pawn cannot be taken. In this case, same thing as the previous variation. Rook e1 just wins because after f5, f3, and there is no check. So that is why a6 was played. But a6 does give a pawn, and in a way, Rapport was basically arguing, okay, I could take your e-pawn now, and sure, you can try to take this pawn, but then I take this pawn. It's not going to be so clear. I think I can work this out. But what if instead of this, he tried bishop f6? Well, now after something like, let's say, f3, just to hold the e-pawn, a6, in this case, this is a little bit different, because this actually gives black a lot of drawing chances. White of course can play much better than this, but this just goes to show that this is not a simple endgame. This pawn is not secure. These dark squares are completely dominated, so it's not very clear how white should make progress here. But in any case, I mean, something like rook d7 maybe, but you have to watch out for back rank tricks, and you have to watch out for queen f2 mate. So it's not so clear. But a6. Now, the point of bishop f6, the reason I mentioned it is because it kind of steps out of this tactic. So rook e1 wouldn't work there. So bishop takes, and now the queen takes. And this isn't so simple to defend, and I think here Ding made a mistake. This rook is very active on this file, and I think he was kind of wary of the checks, and maybe he was worried about his king safety. And maybe he thought that if he could somehow exchange the queens, he would be in a much better endgame, which is true. However, he missed that basically after this, he has no way of exchanging the queens here. The queen just bounces back. Now, I mentioned this because he had a much better chance here instead of rook e1. A good way for white to make progress is just to take on g6 first, just to make sure the h-pawn is never hanging. offering an exchange of queens. And the queen will have to basically guard this bishop. The only place it can really go is like f4 or f5. Let's say queen f5, that seems more solid. And then rook d7. And this takes over the 7th rank, and the queen will actually coordinate with the rook at some point and try to invade. I mean, queen d3 might come, just to offer the exchange of queens again. And the king is actually pretty safe with the rook and queen around it, especially on f1. He's actually okay. Maybe he was worried about bishop g3 tricks, but it's not really there. So for example, if after bishop f6, g3, this trick is no longer possible, the bishop moves back. This gives the king a little bit more cover, but it also, this check does nothing, the king just moves away. So I thought this was a much better way to play, actually. Instead, rook e1 was played. And after this, he didn't have a chance to actually exchange queens at all. And Rapport just kind of checked him around. And here Ding tried to play g3 just to avoid extra checks. And now bishop d4, threatening mate in 1. I don't think a 2800 would miss that. Queen e2, again offering the exchange of queens. Queen c3. Now rook d1. And Ding gets back on this file. So that is a way for White to make progress. Now here, Rapport played a great move, queen c6. I think if he were to play something like bishop here, I think this actually might be a problem. Again, White might actually get counterplay here, so it's not obvious. But maybe queen c6 is not a good is a good reply to that. Now that I look at it, this is actually annoying. So maybe not rook d7 immediately, but I just think that queen c6 is just a really good solution here. So of course, if takes, then check. That's checkmate. There's nothing you could do there. So he had to play queen g4 here to give his king some room. Now this is not working this time because the king runs and the queen's under attack. The bishop is under attack, and there's nothing that Black can do about this. So instead, he played here e5, which is a great move. Just basically holding this bishop together. Nothing can move this bishop at all. And Black can maybe start to try to pick off this a pawn here. It's actually not so clear. I mean, I'd kind of prefer Black in this position because this rook is inactive, this queen is not going anywhere, and the queen on c6 is an excellent piece. So is the bishop on d4, of course. So as Black, I'd actually like this position. That's why Ding took this bishop, because I don't think he could have survived without it, with it on the board, I'm sorry. And they just led into this perpetual here, and after king j8, they agreed to draw. So key takeaways from this game. Ding did have a lot of chances to play on here, but Rapport definitely found some really good moves. For example, after bishop g5, this is a critical position here. Rapport wisely chose to give up the exchange instead of going into something with f6, because this would have been very unclear because of how many pieces are on the board. This would have been a very difficult game to defend, actually. So I think Rapport actually chose correctly to take the pawn instead and just give up the exchange, because now he removed a center pawn and he removed the dark squared bishop, which was a very vital defender. That takes a lot of guts to do in a candidates game. And after this, for example, I think Ding Liren just kind of missed his shot. For example, like he just missed the idea of just rook d7. I think he underestimated just how strong that would be, and maybe he overestimated Black's chances on the king side. But yeah, it was just a very clean draw from Rapport. He was able to hold it all together without collapsing or making any sort of real bad mistakes. I think his mistake was actually stepping into this opening. Ding was very well prepared for this, and I think Rapport was just had this worst position from the go, and he managed to hold it just barely. Something after rook e1, I mean, like White basically had no way of making progress here, especially after these pawns are exchanged. This pawn is not going anywhere. Rapport played a good game. What can I say? So yeah, that's that. I'll see you in the next round. I guess that's all for today.